All right, folks, we're going to get started right now. First of all, I just want to say that I am very grateful that we are here on the last full day of the conference, the last session. It is the 4th of July for those of us who celebrate. So I appreciate everyone being here. And I will try to reward you by, I think this is an interesting talk. We have some good charts to show you. We have some good, it's kind of an interesting experiment from our side. If I were to offer one thing to make it even more exciting, I would recommend that you listen to this talk, and as you listen to this talk, you take yourselves and you bring yourself back about 10 years. Was anyone at Harvard 10 years ago for the very first Open Ethics conference? One? Very cool. Yeah. So 10 years ago, what's your name? Shelley. Shelley and I were there at Harvard, and we were talking about this new phenomenon of MOOCs. And they were disruptive, and they were revolutionary, and they were going to democratize education. But there was this nagging thing about completion rates and engagement rates. We said, gosh, this technology is so great, but how do we fix the completion rates and the engagement rate? That was the wording. How do we fix this thing? And since then, the dialogue around that has kind of changed. This hasn't come up in a while. But Shannon and I, through an experiment we did, we've kind of stumbled across a hack to get us there. And we'll talk about what that is. We'll talk about what we like about it, what we don't like about it, and then how to do it. So by way of a quick agenda, Shannon's going to discuss our experiment and how we ran it. And then I'm going to come back and talk about the results and how to implement what we call hyper-personalized nudge emails, or HPNEs.
Awesome. Thanks, John. Hi, folks. So I'm just going to provide a little bit of context here on the project that we were involved in and the experiment that we did. So this case study or experiment was based in a professional development series of courses for postdocs. So people who have completed their PhDs and are working as postdocs in research institutions. And these courses, there were 2 of them, were built to help postdocs succeed in their role, but also to help them build skills and understand how to articulate the skills that they had learned as postdocs in their career career journey, so whether that was inside or outside of academia. So these 2 courses covered a wide range of topics, including things like working in an intercultural environment, developing resilience, project management, budget management, and even things like finding and landing a job. So how do you look for a job as a postdoc? How do you write your CV? How do you do an interview? What does that process look like? So both of these courses were instructor-paced courses on edX.org, so not on OpenEdX, but on edX.org. They were 6 or 7 weeks each, and there were activities, a couple of activities in each module that learners were encouraged to complete in order to complete the course and get a certificate. In order to get a certificate, they had to do at least half of those activities. I think it's really important to note, especially in this particular context and within these courses, that the partners that we were working with really gave a lot of messaging to learners about finding the pieces within this course that were most relevant to them. So they weren't actually pushing completion in this course. They were saying, we want you to focus on the areas that are of most interest to you, or areas where you think that you need additional learning and support. So for example, if you had no interest in becoming a primary investigator, maybe you could skip the module about project management and grants management, because that may not be relevant to you in the future. So that's a little bit of context about the courses we were working in. So what was the problem? So with anyone, as John mentioned, have always been these questions about engagement and completion. So this was a relatively high enrollment course, given that this is such a specific and sort of narrow niche population. So each run of these courses had about 1,500 students in it. They had about 20% active participants, so lots of people who registered, lots of people who didn't actually ever come into the course. And they sort of hit that, pretty typical MOOC completion rate of about 5 to 7%. So like everyone, this group was interested in how we could have learners engage more deeply in this content and complete more of these activities. Again, not necessarily complete the whole course, but complete the activities. So they asked John and I if we had any ideas or suggestions, which leads me to our proposed solution. which is not at all a novel idea. It's essentially an email campaign. So what we wanted to do was we wanted to update sort of that generic weekly email that learners get, the start of every week. Hey, this module is open. We encourage you to come in. Reminder of a deadline. We wanted to update that using the activity and grade data that was available within the edX platform so that we could personalize these emails. So one of the things that we wanted to make sure that we were doing was creating this this aura of an instructor presence. We know that we know that learners oftentimes feel anonymous in these MOOCs, that there isn't a lot of connection always, especially in something that's self-directed, asynchronous. And we know from the research that instructor presence can help motivate learners. And we wanted to be able to provide encouragement and reminders and thank yous. We wanted to show gratitude to our learners. So we wanted to be able to help our partners in figuring out how to take all of this data and turn it into what we were calling these hyper-personalized nudge emails. So, like all good marketers, which we are not, but we knew that some A/B testing was going to be important. We were also partnered with some R1 schools, heavily research-intensive schools based in the United States. So we knew that engaging in some sort of research project was going to be important. So we had these two research questions. Essentially, do these HPNEs increase engagement, and do they increase completion rates? So we created a little experiment. So basically what we decided to do was to split our learners in this course into two cohorts. So at the beginning of week 3, so we let our learners come in, do a couple weeks worth of work. At week 3, we split these learners into two groups, either our control group or our experimental group. We did our best to split those groups randomly, but also control for some factors that we knew were important. So one thing that we knew based on previous runs of this course, we had more females who were in these courses and more females who completed these courses. So we tried to control for that as best we could. And we also wanted to control for roughly the same number of non-starters. So up to week 3, if you hadn't yet started the course, we tried to control to have sort of equal numbers within this space. So then at week 3, we used that grade and activity data to send messages to folks who were in that experimental group based on the amount of work that they had done. So we had two groups within that experimental group. One was our participators, people who had done at least one of the activities, and our non-participators, people who hadn't yet done any of the activities in the course. John will talk a little bit about the fact that we changed this based on results. We ran this experiment twice. The first time we ran it, we sent 5 of these HPNE emails. And then in the second run, which is the run that you see up here, we decided to shorten that down to only 3. And I think it is important to note that the folks who were in the participator group, they got different messages based on how much they had participated. So it wasn't just one email that went out to every single person who had done something. So let's take a look at some of these emails so we can see what they looked like. So a couple of things to keep in mind. Like any good email campaign, we started with our learner's name. We also had the leader of the Postdoc Academy was also involved, and so she introduced herself. So that was something that we thought would provide a little bit of that instructor presence and personalization. For this one in particular, we see that this learner had completed one of the activities. By week 3, they should have completed 2. So we let them know, okay, we're tracking. We know that you've done 1. We gave them a little bit of a, don't worry if you haven't completed all of these so far, you can come back to them. We pointed out a module that we knew had been interesting to previous learners. We actually did know this. This group had run focus groups before and found out that this was the most exciting, interesting module from their learners. So we didn't make that up. That was actually real. We also provided some information about an upcoming assessment, and if anybody needed any support in that, how they could reach out and get that support. And then we provided a direct link right into the module so that people could jump right in and complete the activity that we were talking about. Here's another example of a participator email just to show that they were different. So here, this person had completed both of the activities that they should have completed up until this point. We thanked them for their engagement. Again, we told them about this upcoming activity that people had previously enjoyed. Again, giving them some support if they needed it for their upcoming assessment. So what did our non-participators get? So our non-participators got a thank you for enrolling. We sort of gave you, we hope that you have time to start. There's still opportunities to catch up. Again, this idea of, there's a module in here that our previous learners had enjoyed, a link to that. And then the thing that's slightly different here too is also if you have any questions or comments or feedback, that, here's an email you can let us know if you've got any questions or things that you want to share. So this is week 3. This is the first HP&E email that they got. You can see the messaging is slightly different, and John will get into the details when he does the demo at the second half of this talk about how we actually built this. So I'll give another quick example before I hand things over to John. So this is at week 7, so the very last week of the course, the beginning of that week, someone who had participated, we gave them a reminder. You've only got a few days left. A thank you for participating over the last 6 weeks and for taking their learning seriously. So encouraging them, thanking them, showing that gratitude, giving them a list of modules where they still had incomplete activities. So again, based on the learner and what they had completed, they could link directly back into what they had, what was missing. And then, of course, we also gave them a reminder about, you have to complete 5 of the activities in order to get your certificate. For a non-participator by week 7, again, the reminder, we only have a few days left. A gentle nudge. If you've been procrastinating, here's an opportunity. You can still get in there and do some of these activities, again, linking to where those activities are, and a reminder about what needed to be completed in order for them to get that certificate if that's what they were pursuing. So now that we've seen what these emails look like, I'm going to hand it over to John, and John's going to talk us through some of the responses and data related to these research questions.
Thanks. Okay, so as we get back into the results, let's bring ourselves back to the research questions. So the questions that we wanted to ask are, do HP&Es increase engagement, and do HP&Es increase completion rates? Let's start with the engagement question. So we found that HP&Es did indeed increase completion rates, both in terms of the number of individuals that participated and how much they participated. So on the left, let's get this laser here. On the left chart here, this is the number of control students, so the students who got regular Monday emails, who participated in the course, versus the number of experimental students. These are what we call our experimental or HP&E, the students who got these hyper-personalized nudge emails. And we saw an increase in the number of students who participated in the course of 46%, from 89 to 130. What we did then is we excluded all of the non-participants. So we basically took away the credit for getting more students in the course and asked the question, are the students who are getting these HP&Es completing more activities? And we found as well that our control group completed about 19 activities, and our experimental group completed about 22 and a half activities. That's an increase of 19%. And what we want to do next is we wanted to determine if this was a result of our intervention, of our HP&Es. And we determined that HP&Es did have a sustained effect that wasn't seen prior to the HP&E experiment. It wasn't seen in the control group, and it wasn't seen in a group of experimental users who never opened the emails. So these are folks that got the HP&E emails that were basically HP&E non-participators. And there's 2 charts here. I'm going to show them each on a slide just so it's bigger and easier to see. So this is a measure of the participation rate per week. And you see a very familiar kind of chart here, where at the beginning of a MOOC, you have several students start. You have this kind of sharp decline in the early weeks, then it kind of levels off, and then it gets a little bump towards the end when people are trying to get their certificate, right? And the blue line here is the control. These are the folks who got our regular emails, our Monday emails. And the red line is the experimental group. And you can see that they follow the same trend until the experimental group gets their first HP&E email. And then you see an increase in the experimental group. This is, again, the number of participators, or the participation rate, I should say, for these experimental group. And that remains at a level higher than the control Still kind of carries this downward trajectory, but at this point it's higher than the control. And then you have a little bit of a bump again, the decline here between weeks 4 and 5, where our next email is a little bit steeper in the control than it is in our experimental. And then you get a slightly higher final bump with our last HPNE email because people are trying to finish the course. This is looking at that per capita number. Again, taking out the non-participators, just looking at the per capita. And you can see that they start out, the control and the experimental, they start out at roughly the same place. And actually the control for a while is completing more activities per user than our experimental group. And then there's this inflection point right around this second HPNE email. And by the end of it, you see that our experimental group has completed more activities than our control group. And then we also controlled for our experimentals that never opened our emails, who, again, started off pretty strong, but then leveled off by the end of the course. So, to summarize, we do believe that our HPNEs were responsible for this increase in activity. So the next research question was, do our HPNEs increase completion? And again, when you look at the numbers, the control group, in our control group, 14 users completed the course. Whereas for our experimental group, 31 users completed the course. So that's an increase of 121%. And this bears out in our historical numbers, where the historical average for this course, we've run this course something like 8 or 9 times, and we haven't changed the course content in any kind of meaningful way, and the audience remains the same, different students obviously. Our historical average is about 5% completion. And that holds true to what we saw in our control group, which is 4.86, very close to 5%, whereas our experimental group had a completion rate of 10.76%. So that's a 115% increase over the historical average. So I want to get in now into what we have learned along the way. But I want to start with our goals. So this was an experiment. And so, you know, when we talk about what we've learned, well, we want to figure out, well, why are we learning these things? So the goal with HPNEs is we want HPNEs to be as effective as possible, but we don't want them to be obnoxious. There's a lot of ways I can get students to complete a course, right? I can email them more. I can call them on the phone. There's a lot of ways that I can get students to complete a course, but we don't want to be obnoxious with it. So we want to learn kind of how to be as effective as possible without being obnoxious. So we're going to talk about timing, language, and the late participator phenomenon. So first of all, a reminder, we ran this experiment twice. And so a lot of what we're learning, we learned in experiment 1 and applied it to experiment 2. And you'll see some of the results of that. One is that timing is important. So we know, and we saw it in the earlier slides, this is just a generic kind of MOOC participation rate slide. We know that this is kind of the pattern of MOOCs. Where they'll typically lose a large chunk of their participants early on, levels off, and then you get this bump. And so the most important time to reach out to our participants, we find, is early in the course, as people are getting in, and then late in the course, right around this bump point. And then in experiment 2, we added 1 in the middle, just for good measure. And so what we saw is that, I don't know if I have a slide for this, no. What we saw is that in experiment 2, where we had fewer emails, we had a much higher success rate. That's not because we had fewer emails, but I think what it means is that you don't need to bash your students over the head with these emails. You need to be strategic about the timing of these emails. Secondly, language is important. This was a really fascinating week in experiment 1. So this is the chart for experiment 1. Again, shows this kind of the HPNE, the experimental group that has a higher participation rate. But there's this dip in week 5, very clear dip. And when we look at the numbers of this, we asked ourselves, we looked back on what we did. We said, my goodness, we must have made a mistake somewhere. We must have measured something wrong. We must have sent the email to the wrong group of students. We must have, put some sort of word in the email that hit everyone's spam folder and, didn't reach the students. We didn't find evidence of any of that. Everything looked normal. The only thing in week 5 of experiment 1 that was significantly different is that the language was different. And a piece of language, again, these emails are all different for each student. That's kind of the point. But some of the language is the same, common for certain students. So a common bit of language that went out in week 5 was this. And it says, this module is a bit longer with 2 course assessments. Don't worry. We encourage you to go at your own pace based on your schedule. The course will stay open until July 24th, 11:59 p.m., and that July 24th was 2 weeks away from when students got that email. So it's very much this kind of take it easy, take it at your own pace language. And so what we learned is that messages don't need to be urgent. We're not using emojis and exclamation points and that kind of thing. But messages need to be timely and they need to be immediately actionable. Third thing we've observed is that HPNEs have this tendency to attract late participants. So in a MOOC, the way that we define a late participant is if you haven't joined in week 1 in a MOOC, it is rare that you will join in further weeks. Late participants in MOOCs are unicorns. They don't happen very often. And in both cases, we found that some of our increased participation is due to the fact that we're able to bring in late participators. I'm not sure why this is, but it did hold true in both experiments. So in experiment 1, we had 98 experimental HPNE users participate for the first time after week 1, so late participants, versus 74 for the control. In experiment 2, we saw the same phenomenon. We saw 67 experimental group users participate for the first time after week 1 versus 37 for the control. Here are some other factors. They're not lessons learned because we don't necessarily have the data to confirm these things. These are things that we observe. They are hunches that we have that we think are important. We want to mention them, but we don't have the data to call them a lesson, I suppose. So one is in experiment 2, we sent an intro email, and that intro email went out to all the users, and it came from the course director, and that course director is also an important figure in this community of postdocs. So that kind of plays on this idea of instructor presence, kind of sending an email and making, it's a MOOC, so it's not going to be a totally personal connection, but making some sort of personal connection between the instructor and the students. Secondly, sender importance. That's related to the intro email, sender importance. So in experiment 2, the email that this came from, or the name of the person this came from, was also the course director, who is also an important figure in this community of postdocs. She's well known. Whereas for experiment 1, they were introduced from a more unknown administrator. Still personal, hey, my name is Alex, but not as well known as the sender in experiment 1. And so we're not sure what effect this had, but we think it had some effect. The third is email reputation. And this is more of a technical thing. When you send an email, at least from edX.org, and everyone's got their own OpenEdX instance, so don't know what your email rules are, but when you send an email from edX.org, it comes from some email that's something like no reply -course@edX.org. And when you send an email from HPNEs, we'll show how they're set up in a little bit, they come from whatever email you say. So in this case, we had a Gmail account that belonged to this particular organization. It is unclear how aggressively emails that come from no reply at edX.org are being filtered into places like the promotions folder, the spam folder potentially, versus our Gmail account that we were using for this. So I don't have open rates to compare. If anyone wants to share privately kind of the open rates they see for their kind of bulk emails, I'd be fascinated, because that would kind of give us some insight into this. But we don't have the numbers to really confirm this. We do think it was a factor, though. Okay, so I'm going to talk through implementation. I'm going to try to switch mics here. Let's see what happens. Hopefully, no. You got that one? Okay, thank you. Check. Nope. Check. Okay, good. Okay. So we have released kind of how we've done this and our template for doing this for those that are interested in it. So here's how you can actually run this. And I've simplified it a bit for clarity. But there's a few steps involved. So it's got to get a little bit technical. But what we're doing is there's a template, and it's at bit.ly.hpne. We can just go there. We'll go, and it's this one. Sorry, I feel very low on this one, so let me try to stay here. Okay. So there's a template. You need to configure some credentials in AWS to allow this template to send emails and receive notifications. And then you need to customize your email templates as needed based on the data that you have, your audience, your data, your messaging needs. And so I'll show what that looks like. So this is the sheet. This is kind of, some disclaimers and more steps than I'm going to go through here in terms of getting these credentials. But essentially you need some AWS access keys, which I will delete right after this talk. These are my secret keys for this. Some AWS access keys, what's called an SES, Simple Email Service configuration set, and an email that you can send email from. You have those things, you can set this up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go into this document here, which, again, if you have the link to it, you can just kind of copy this. It comes with all the code that's in it. And I'm going to set these credentials. So it's going to ask me for my access key. It's going to ask me for my secret key, my not so secret key. Ask me for my region, my configuration set, and what email I want to send this from. And it's got to run. Live demos, these are great. Too many triggers. Well, we'll see if it, let me try it one more time. I think that because I configured this before, I think it will still work, but we'll give it a shot. Okay, doesn't like any triggers. That's okay. So what we're going to do is, I believe it is authorized. Now we're going to talk about building the email. So the email is built in blocks. So this has 3 sample emails. Obviously, you'd have a whole bunch of emails that come from your course. And we're going to build our email in blocks. So you'd say something like, hello, name of the student. Good morning, student. There's a lot of this, like concatenating things. And you build the messages like this. You say, Sam, let's say you are awesome in capital letters. And let's say, these 2 students get links. You can also create templates. So if you don't want to type and copy and paste, a bunch of times in this document here, you can kind of create these templates and then refer to them with this nomenclature, T-links, or T-whatever your template name is. Any empty blocks are ignored, and then these particular students get a survey and a signature at the end, which again are just kind of templates, with a link to a survey and a signature. So let's go back, before we send this, let's go back and talk about what this is doing. So what we just saw is our worksheet. That worksheet is authorized to talk to Amazon SES, which is the service that actually sends our emails. That service also talks to Amazon SNS, which is a notification service. And essentially, our worksheet is subscribed to these notifications. So we can get things like, did the student open the email? Did they click on the email? So let's try to send these now. Dismiss. So send bulk emails. And it should. Oh, didn't do it. Hang on. I'm going to try to do a little bit of surgery right here. Triggers. Almost there. Okay, let's try that again. I'm going to store my credentials one more time. Okay, there we go. Let's send this again. So I'm going to send bulk emails. Okay, so they've sent, that ID is kind of how AWS tracks whether someone's opened that. I'm going to move over to my kind of spam email area. And there's my email. Good morning, Sam. You are awesome. I'm going to click on the link. It just goes to Google. And now let me go back here. And what this sheet will do is it will pull in whether a student opened it, whether they clicked it on a schedule. But if we want to kind of jumpstart that and get it now, we can click on that. And what we should see is that the message was delivered first of all. The student did open it. The student opened it today. And they clicked on it as well. Okay. Thanks for bearing with me on that. So the only thing that we've stripped out, we can go back to the presentation. Thank you. So that all exists. You can use it. The only thing we've stripped out is, thank you, is how we built these emails, just for simplicity, because we pulled in a lot of data into that sheet essentially, and then did some logic on it to determine, where the student was in the course. But this is kind of the simplified version. So the data we relied on mostly was who is our student, what is their grade, how many activities they've done, and where are they in the schedules. This is a typical kind of set of data that we would have for someone that was on track. So we would configure an email that might say some other things, but kind of highlighting, hi, name of the student, thank you for completing both activities in the course so far. We want to thank you for your engagement. Whatever module name was next, hope it continues to be helpful. Here is the link to this week's module. Found this to be pretty important. And then a kind of personal sign-off best. Here's a non-participator. Again, we have the same data, who they are, what grade they have. This one has come in and done one activity and then left. And we want to say thank you for something. So thank you for enrolling. I do hope you have some time to start. Again, link to the module. Hope you have a chance to start the course, Paul. So again, this logic would exist in the sheet. We just pulled it out for kind of clarity. So if you are tempted to use this, I want to put two important caveats out there. One, this tool, by default, does not include an opt-out mechanism. To be in compliance with whatever your email regulations are, you will likely need to implement your own opt-out system and way to track opt-outs. Second is effectiveness. This tool has been tested twice. Clearly, there's going to be some sort of diminishing returns if every course on edX or an Open edX instance decides to send personal emails to students. We don't know what that decreasing return is. Right now, this is purely experimental for us. But it's something that we want to highlight before telling people to go run with this. So with that, we just want to say that this was a super exciting experiment for us. It was fun to kind of have this kind of call back to something we've been talking about for many, many years. And I want to thank our partners who kind of said to us, hey, what can we do? And we came to them with this idea, and they were just supportive the entire time. So the Postdoc Academy, Boston University, Michigan State University, University of Wisconsin, and Northwestern. And I want to thank everyone in this room, again, for being here on the last presentation, on the last full day of the conference, and you've made it. So, thank you. Mary Ellen, we got a mic? Yeah.
Thanks for sticking to this work. I supported it early on and said that it would be hard to see the results because others have tried this and they quit or didn't publish the results because there wasn't a big enough effect size. So I'm glad that you dug deep to find the differences.
I want to talk about it. I want to figure out if we got lucky or whether there was some magic sauce, but sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I think it's sticking to it and really tweaking really small things, and then the outcome is not necessarily going to be huge, you solved everything, but a lot of small tweaks can then help overall. I was going to ask about the open rate, but you don't know that. But Marcos Morales, who was here earlier, asked him about open rates because that's why they set up things that are automatic on edX.org. I'm pretty sure he was involved in that.
Yeah.
And he'll know about open rates. He said they had good results with open rates before, but,
Yeah.
and then I was going to ask about the opt-out. So with your control, is that with edX.org emails you were saying? Or is it still with the Gmail too?
The controls with edX.org.
Okay, because
Yeah.
really your control is a much larger population because you're emailing from the Gmail only people who opt in to being emailed outside the platform, right?
We split the course down the middle,
Uh-huh.
extracted the opt-outs, and at that point we had even audience sizes. So we did send emails to the same size audience once we made that decision. We waited for the course
Yeah.
to start, so we knew who was in our course, so we knew kind of demographic details, we knew who was a verified learner, and those are the things we split by to make sure that we had, as even as possible or similar as possible, a control versus experimental course. They were the same size of the same number of emails went out
Yeah.
to each. Regarding open rates, we know our open rates for the HP&E emails, and they were, they're in a chart somewhere, they were high. I don't want to say the number, but they were much higher than a typical bulk email, which makes some sense because a lot of times it was, hey, John, how you doing in module 3 or something like that. So it was, it was not your typical bulk email messaging. And it came from a different email as well.
Yeah.
So they were high. I just don't have what I don't have is I don't have the comparison data set to compare it to, what the open rates of our control group has. We don't have that data.
And in today's email, the not the open rate, but for sure it goes to promotions folder in Gmail when I send bulk emails from edX.org.
Yeah.
So that's where
Yeah.
they're going and being ignored.
Yeah, Google's logic is murky and we have no control over it. But yes, I'm not surprised it goes there.
One thing, one thing just to add too that we really didn't get a chance to chat about in this, but in regards to that personalized email and that sending from a credible person, we actually had people respond to the emails and be like, "Hey Sarah, thanks so much for reaching out. Yeah, I'm about to get into this or whatever." So it was actually really interesting. We didn't capture them because there were only really a handful of them, but it was interesting that we did get some responses. People thought there really was an actual human tracking them and connecting with them. And we did respond. So Sarah and her team, when they did get an email about that was in response to one of these HP&Es that we had sent, they would send a response to that person as well. So it also created this opportunity for them to engage a little bit further.
Hi.
Hi.
I love this. This is great, and it's great to see kind of what you're doing. Just in terms of how big those groups were. So you said between your control and what was the participation size again? It was 100 and...
We have 588 per group or something.
Okay.
Those are the completers, yeah. But what was the original sample size? It was something in the neighborhood of 588, I think is the number that's in my head, roughly that.
So I'm very curious because we, in our context, what we do is we have a natural clustering of students. We're able to kind of group them by location or something into smaller cohorts within a course. So typically 50 or under. And something we've been experimenting with is a leaderboard. So a monthly or weekly leaderboard.
Yeah.
And I'm just curious if you had considered something like that or highlighting top performers or...
The tangentially related thing, and it's tangential, is that one thing that we know for a fact, and this is not just for this course, but this particular course has, what are those postdoc group called? The live groups? PALs. This group, this has something called PALs, which are these live meetup sessions that can occur through the course. So you can say, hey, I want to join a PALs group. And we know that those correlate very highly to better engagement, better completion. So we thought about using information, which we'd have to get from their email about like, hey, you're part of Northwestern. It was a little bit, getting into the creepy factor. Like, hey, you're from Northwestern. Like there's we have a weekly session with Northwestern students, based on, their geography or their school affiliation was. We didn't feel like the data was strong enough. We felt it got a little creepy, so we didn't do it. But that's like as tangentially close we got to things like, you know, leaderboards and different ways of grouping these students essentially.
I just think that there is so yes, it's creepy if you can kind of acknowledge that you're going to do it. There is also potentially some benefit in the peer aspect of encouraging, so
Yeah.
especially around engagement.
Yeah.
And like non-starters versus starters.
Yeah.
They can see their colleagues falling behind. They say, well, hey.
Yeah. I mean, let me like caveat that a little bit and say like what I think, you know, crosses the creepy border is if, you know, Sarah, who allegedly has 1,200 students, is figuring out that this student goes to Northwestern, that is. But, I mean, you know, drawing this idea out, like if there was some sort of a mechanism to say, hey, I'm a Northwestern student, there might be a TA in the course. And so I email the Northwestern students. Like that is, you know, a very logical, I think, place for something like this to go. So it's a good idea. Thank you.
So you answered my first question already around like how do you respond to people who respond. My second question is around like automation or how manual the process is. So if did you have to sit and sift through and also if I'd imagine there'd be some learners who they engage initially and then they stop engaging and maybe there's a different kind of an email. Maybe there's 3 tiers or something later on.
Yeah, it was a lot of work. It was more work than it is worth at this small scale because it was me going through the course and saying, all right, where are we in the course? How do I group my learners? Like if you're a week ahead, if you're right on schedule, if you're 2 weeks behind, like how does the message, and people, I'm surprised no one's asked me yet. People have asked like, oh, would you use like AI to write these emails and stuff? And no, we didn't because that was not the point is to give a student a very targeted, so we wanted a lot of control of the messages, I'll say it that way. And it was a lot of work to figure out what your groups are and what messaging you want to give those groups, and then organizing those messages, because again, you might give this person this message here and this person this message here, depending on what other messaging you needed to give them. So it was a lot of work. That being said, I think that was a function of the fact that this was experimental. And we all just had this in a Google sheet saying like, well, how do we do that this week? If this became a process, I think that those are the kind of things that you would iron out that would make this 10x faster. But it took a lot of hours to like hack away at this, yeah.
But just to add to that, I do think that we found the second time that we ran the experiment, it did go faster the second time. So the first time we kind of had no idea what we were doing and we were writing messages and going back and forth. And then we were able to sort of take what we learned from that first, reuse some of that language or change some of that language. And it did move faster the second time around. And we have talked about, you know, what are the ways that this can be automated, but it was a lot of manual work. Even the data polls, doing data polls every week, that was a big part of it as well. So yeah, it was a pretty manual process the first couple times around, but obviously open to ideas and suggestions on how to get it automated if people are interested.
And even the data polls, like we did those manually at first, and that was a lot of pain. Then we automated that in the second one. So there's a lot of room for improvement, but I think it's quick kinds of improvement.
Yeah. Thank you very much for sharing. At P2PU, we've done a few similar things with the bigger courses that we ran in the past, and I think we kind of had a similar uptick in engagement, like roughly, like if it's 6 to 7% completion or engagement, it's like about double. And it depends on how, like you put in energy, you're making it better, but I think it kind of tracks with what we've experienced. But a question I have is, when you've done this research, have you considered gathering any qualitative data from people, kind of just like giving people the opportunity to say like, you know, tell us if you're struggling or tell us if you feel like you don't want to complete anymore? Because I feel like sometimes it's like we miss the reason why people are not completing, and when you hear that reason, it's sometimes like you feel like, well, actually, you know what, that's a really good reason for not completing. I wouldn't force you to complete.
Yeah, absolutely. So those questions and that qualitative research wasn't part of this experiment, but it is something that our partners, specifically at BU and Northwestern, have been doing. So they have been doing throughout all the multiple runs of these courses focus groups and qualitative research around, again, things like what were the most interesting or exciting modules or activities that you did, what do you want more of, what do you want less of. So it is something that those folks were looking at. I do think that one of the things that we looked at after having done this experiment twice was thinking again about this push towards completion, especially given that the tenor of these courses in the actual content in the course itself is a very much a, hey, pick and choose, right? What is most valuable to you? These courses were also given sort of special evergreen access, so learners could hold on to these for longer than like a normal edX course, so that they would have access to these resources beyond, the 6 weeks of the course. So I do think that the messaging sometimes in the email was a little bit at odds with the overall philosophy of these courses. But I do know that that BU and Northwestern are continuing to engage in a lot of that qualitative research. And I do think that they have been sharing some of that in different places. So if you want to connect, we can connect you up with that team and they can share their research with you. Great question though, because I agree. I think that it's really important to think about what's the purpose of this? And we've had conversations with this group and with other groups before about, is completion the gold standard? And for some people, I'll stop, I know. I know I'm between you and a rugby game right now, so I apologize. But so we do know that that some folks, for the grants that they're getting to run these, completion rates are a big part of that, numbers are a big part of that. But this group very much believed in, as long as we're getting them to engage and complete the activities, the ones that are most important or valuable to them, that is good enough. And that was considered success by this team. So I will stop there because we're out of time. Thanks so much, everybody. I hope that you enjoy the rugby game. I'm going to be controversial here and say go Ireland instead of South Africa, but you can beat me up in the hallway on the way out later. That's fine. All right. Thanks, everybody.